Yep, I'll read my going. All right, cool. Audio working for people?
Audio.
Any issues with the mind mic?
Good to go.
Awesome. All right. So, hello. Thank you for coming to my talk on building mods for VR, even if you don't necessarily have a VR headset. But first, who am I, right? I mean, you can look above my head. My name's Hammy275. I also go by 275 Hammy. This is confusing, I know. And I've been...
But you're very loud on my end.
Oh, yeah.
You're very loud on the stream.
Sure, I can go ahead and turn down the mic real quick. Let me backtrack the presentation real quick. Let me go into voice chat settings real quick here. Does this sound better? Is this too loud, too quiet? What does this sound like? Okay, cool. I'll run with that then. Oh, a bit quiet, much better. Okay. Okay, yeah, I'll run with that for the time being. Awesome. So I guess it's just to take it from the top. Hello, welcome to my presentation on building mods for VR. You don't necessarily need to have a VR headset to do it. And we then immediately lag half the server. That's funny. That's timing. Just the thought of this server running Vivecraft gives it a headache. That's understandable. We'll wait till everyone comes back in, give it a couple minutes. No worries. I'm also recording this locally, but it's going to have the very wrong POV, so... Thank you.
Hey, I'm just gonna ask you to re-mic for the people who have rejoined.
Oh, yeah.
No, you're not connected to the mic now. Can you re-mic? Connect to the wireless mic.
There we go. Hopefully that's better.
Yep, we're good.
Awesome. Yep, I'll go ahead and get started. Take 3. So hi, welcome to my talk on building mods for VR, whether you even have a VR headset or not. So just to hop into things, who am I? Why should you be listening to me talk about this? Well, my name is Hammy275, or 275 Hammy. You can see the former above my head. The latter is probably more confusing. And yes, I know this is a confusing distinction. Don't worry, it was worse before. And I've been modding Minecraft for a decent while. I started around 1.7.10. That didn't go well because I didn't learn Java and didn't try to put in much effort to actually learn things properly. I thought basic Python would be enough. Tried again during 1.12, didn't work. And then finally actually properly knew Java around the time of 1.16 when I had finally taken like AP Computer Science. And it's like, wow, that actually gives you a Java experience, and then went from there. Between that time, I'd done a bunch of command blocking, and you can see on the picture basically like my progression through modding. And then why should you be listening to me about more so a VR talk specifically? Well, put simply, I have developed for VR things, mainly immersive MC. Shameless plug. You should go check out the booth. Mainly it serves to, among other things, put a bunch of GUIs into the game world so it doesn't detract from the experience of playing in VR, as what you're going to hear a lot during this talk is GUIs and VR do not go well together. It also does some other things that are unique for VR players, but I'm not going to be going into this mods feature set much. So, why should you be doing this? Like, why should you make your mod better for VR players? Well, from least to most, I think, impactful for a reason. From the least impactful, there's not many players in this space, right? So if you're looking at this from like a I guess a competition perspective, you're not going to have much competition, right? But I think far more importantly is it's an interesting challenge, right? This is a unique and interesting way of doing mod development. And honestly, as a whole, I think especially the ones that don't require VR headset necessarily, it will just make your mods just better. Like, it'll help it to be a more designed, well-rounded out mod. So this talk is generally talks about two different things that are kind of feel like two sides of the same coin, but honestly could also be seen as not. You have not pulling players out of the experience of the game or the mod, and also maximizing a player's immersion in the experience. Again, these do sound like two sides of the same coin, but I think a good example of how it's kind of not, or how you can try to do one and end up messing up the other, is if you imagine a VR player holding a fireball in their hand, you would think to immerse them into the world, you'd want to constantly rumble their controller. It's radiant, powerful, strong heat and magic, presumably. However, in practice, this is going to feel really out of place, and it's going to pull players out of the experience very quickly, because constant controller rumble just doesn't make sense. So to get into why this is a major issue... Yeah, exactly. It'll also destroy their batteries. But to get into why this is a major issue, flat screen is not the same as VR, and although not mentioned in the title, VR is not the same as real life. VR is like, especially in controlled experiences, VR ends up being this weird middle ground between flat screen play and real life play. Like, for example, in comparison to VR play and flat screen play, there's a lot of extra movement things you can do that just don't work well in VR. Barring motion sickness for some people aside, there are just some controls that just don't work in a VR environment. And then for real life play, or just things in real life, you can't actually just one-to-one translate that to VR. The main thing I will forever point to this is a talk given by a developer at Valve for 1 hour plus FAQ on trying to make doors work well in Half-Life Alyx. Just doors. Just designing doors and nothing else. That is how much of a mess this is. And that's because, like, for example, pulling door handles just don't work well in VR because there's no physical feedback beyond, like, vibration, for example. But of course, this is a controlled VR experience, right? We're not in one of those. We are in a sandbox game with a Vivecraft VR mod on top, and our goal is to make mods work with that. This makes the problem even worse. So, what do we do? Well, as I alluded to previously, there's two major portions of things we can do. There's the things that you don't need VR headset or VR API to do, and ones that you would probably want those things. So first, in terms of the non-VR required stuff, show statuses in the world. If there's anything you're already doing, this is it, right? If a block is doing something, show that it's doing something. The Minecraft furnace is the obvious example I can point to this. You all know how this works. When a furnace has fuel in it and was cooking something or is cooking something, it shows this. This gives players a good indication of, what's going on. It's good to be able to see this at a glance without opening up a full UI. Now, is this showing you exactly what's going on? No. If you put in 4 food items some amount of time ago, you don't know if your food's done cooking, assuming you used, like, a coal as fuel. Coal could just be burning and the food's done, or not. But it gives a good rough indication, and that's honestly enough. If you want to do something like add to one of those mods that view what you're looking at the top center of the screen, you can add details there. That does help, but I wouldn't say that's necessarily the requirement. The more important thing is you show statuses in the world. Now, just to go immediately to the other extreme, see how often you can minimize GUIs. GUIs, I'm going to say this time and time again, are just not good in VR. They pull people out of the experience very much because inventory management in VR is not good. If anyone here has ever, like, used a Nintendo Wii to type on, like, the Wii's keyboard, imagine that, but for inventory management, because you do just end up pointing your controller at, like, a virtual inventory screen to do whatever, or whatever GUI you have. That is the experience VR players have, and it's not the greatest, to say the least. Could you imagine using a Wii remote to craft, I don't know, something? It's not fun. It's not ideal, at the very least. So, as you, in the extreme cases, for example, mods like Botania appear. They strive themselves in having its, like, minimal GUIs. I'm pretty sure Botania doesn't actually add a single one, except for maybe a config screen. I'm not even sure of that, honestly. Or I guess also technically the guidebook, but you get the gist of it. The less GUIs you can have and the more in-world interactions you can have, the better. It keeps people in the experience, and the lack of GUIs prevent people from being pulled out. That said, I don't also want to compromise the vision of your mod. So if you do need to really use GUIs, just try to minimize the amount of clicking you need to do. And then the last thing I'll say on the non-VR headset required side of things is be mindful of the keys and buttons you use. Vivecraft has this neat thing called the radial menu, which will let you select, basically take control keys and map them to a radial menu to click really quickly. But an important thing to note here is that it doesn't support hold keys. So, like, if you're holding down a button, it just isn't compatible with this. You either need to be a press or a toggle. So if you really need a hold key, I would recommend pulling from what vanilla Minecraft does with the accessibility settings and just let people change it from a hold to a toggle. Furthermore, though, do also be really careful with buttons in the first place. The radial menu isn't great, especially for repeated actions. If you can, try to reuse buttons that already exist in some contextual setting, which I'll get into more when I cover the more VR side of things, or the more VR-specific side of things. And speaking of that, let's get into those. So I'm going to warn you, at the moment, the VR API landscape is a bit interesting. There's an unofficial VR API mod called MC VR API. This is also technically a shameless plug. You can also just link to Vivecraft directly, which doesn't give you a stable of an API service, but just gives you all the features. And then there's a PR open to merge a proper API into Vivecraft to get the best of both worlds, and that will be merged soon, TM. But that said, all these will give you the same feature set at the very least to cover everything I'm going to be talking about here. So the first, I think, important big thing will be controller rumble. This is arguably the easiest thing you could do in this entire talk, right? The thing I mentioned with furnaces effectively at the very beginning, that's something you're probably already doing, but if there's nothing in this talk you're doing right now, this is probably the easiest thing, especially if you have a VR headset. In the same way you would just play a sound effect whenever something happens, it's something that a player is doing. You can just rumble their controller for a little bit. I think a good example, to go back to the fireball example, a good thing you can do is to make a rumble when the player initially summons the fireball, and then when they initially release the fireball, throw it. It gives a real oomph or impact to what the player is doing, helping keep people in the world. Obviously, if you mess this up, it's going to pull people out of it, but if you mess any of these up, that's what's going to happen. And then also I'll get into gesture controls. So gesture controls, these are really useful. If you do these the right way, you can make an extremely immersive experience. Arguably, this is the most immersive thing I've talked about on these slides. For example, with this fishing rod here, you hold the trigger and you throw the fishing rod forward and boom, you cast the line. It feels really intuitive and it's very effective. However, I will note that you heard me say that you hold the trigger when you go to cast it. That's because in order to do gesture controls right, you effectively need to make sure it's extremely contextual in some way. Whether it's literally contextual in a world case, or in the sense of this, where you hold a button to confirm that you want to do the action. Otherwise, someone may just be walking and accidentally cast their fishing rod line, and that's not ideal. In terms of actually using a button, I recommend honestly just reusing, basically you can just honestly look at the left click key attack key, because that's what's used for, that's what's placed on your primary hand's trigger button, which is just a very natural button to hold when you're doing a gesture action. And then also quick notes, if you ever get around to implementing gestures, I will want to point out that the directionality of it can be harder to determine than you'd initially think. If anyone wants to real quick, just take your physical hand right now, in the real world, and make a throwing motion and stop in midair. You may notice that your hand bounces back a bit when your hand stops. This will be picked up in software, and is, I don't want to say necessarily annoying to deal with, but means you actually have to deal with it. And also just the general fact that limbs don't stay still. They move around constantly, even if the tiniest bit. And you need to factor this in when you're on the programming side of things, actually dealing with, say, a throwing action or some other gesture that's directionally based. The way you handle this is relatively simple, honestly. You just gather data for the past few multiple ticks and use that instead of just this tick and last tick. The official API, once that's merged in, will actually be able to handle this for you. But until then, you just need to keep hold of that. Just keep hold of that historical data. And yeah, honestly, that's it. I realize this is a relatively short talk, but just to recap things real quick, to keep players in the experience and prevent them from being pulled out of it in VR, the things you can do without a headset are to show things in the world, to minimize GUIs, and to reduce the amount of buttons or keys you use. And for the in-VR things, you can use controller rumbling and do gesture controls. That's it. Thank you. If people have any questions, go for it.
Will this be compatible with AR and MR, in this case, augmented reality and mixed reality?
Yeah, that's a good question. At the moment, nothing currently exists realistically for that. The only Minecraft AR I know of that currently exists is the old Microsoft HoloLens demo, and that's for a dead platform because HoloLens is discontinued now. I'm not aware of any other AR MR thing. Some of these designs, I think, it depends on what scale you're working at, right? If you're doing augmented reality, but you're still at the scale of a player, most of these should still generally apply. Yeah, Minecraft Earth, actually, that's another good point. Yeah, platform agnostic AR MR is a pain. I mean, hopefully that's what OpenXR is trying to solve. But yeah, no, most of these should generally apply for AR and MR because it's still generally the same interaction experience. You still have controllers in each hand that you're using to interact with the world.
Hey, I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you plan in Immersive MC to support any mods? Like, for example, one big example for me would be Immersive Aircraft in VR is basically unusable unless you enable the Vivecraft option to press keybinds on the virtual keyboard.
Gotcha. I mean, I pretty much constantly try to take suggestions for mods to add compatibility for Immersive MC. Like right now, there's a compatibility with mods unofficially, like Apotheosis, Looter, and Iron Furnaces are the few that I mentioned at the booth. I do want to constantly add more. There is also a separate mod called Vivecraft Compat made by somebody else. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting what your name is right now. Here, let me go back to the slide, actually. That would be a better call. There we go. Still doesn't have their name on it. But yeah, I do want to constantly try to add Compat, but for things that are more so getting the mod to work, I'd imagine that also kind of falls more so into Vivecraft Compat's camp, but I'd PR to them, that's fine. Yeah. Also, I saw, Kachira, you raised your hand. I'm not sure if you got to ask your question or not. Perfect. Also, thank you, Olivia the Vampire. Any other questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think the talk's really cool. Also, I am currently in Vivecraft. Like half an hour ago, I decided to get in VR for the VR talk.
I'm super glad to hear it. I'm glad to see if it runs on this mod pack. Vivecraft recently
30 FPS somehow. Yeah.
Relatively recently, technically around 1.18-ish, moved from being like an installer-based thing that works off of patches to just being a proper like mix-in-based mod. So it became, from that and a lot of mod compatibility improvements on top afterwards, Vivecraft is compatible with like, I'd argue the vast majority of mods at this point. Honestly, the main thing that limits Vivecraft arguably at the moment is the fact that Minecraft's a CPU-heavy game. Vivecraft keeps that in mind, and at the moment, Vivecraft's way it renders for 2 eyes is to render the game twice, which means your poor single CPU core is getting even more hammered than usual with the render thread, so... Oh yeah, it used to be Optifine based. The old installer patch version was Optifine only, but now it's like, yeah, you just install Vivecraft, then you pick whatever performance mod you want, and you're done. Yeah, of course. Oh, is there anything worth mentioning on the rendering side of stuff? That is a really good question. The vast majority of things kind of just work. Vivecraft from basically the start was built to just work off of Vanilla's rendering stuff. Like, for example, Immersive MC, I have not learned a single bit. I, like, barely understand how Minecraft's rendering works, let alone all the extra stuff Vivecraft does on top. But you can just call vanilla rendering functions and things will just work. The only thing I would be careful of is if your mod does really funky things with the camera, that's going to fall apart. Because Vivecraft forces the camera in a certain manner because the camera is based on your head. You can't really move one without moving the other without instantly causing some form of motion sickness. But other than that, just render things as you usually would, and things should just work. How would screen shake work? That's a good question. It probably just wouldn't. I haven't actually tested anything along those lines, but again, things that just mess with the camera don't necessarily work well. I'll have to check to see how Vivecraft does nausea. I'll honestly just need to check. I can try to check and ping back to you on the ModFest Discord if you're in that, if I remember to. Yeah, exactly. You'd probably need to turn on like the camera setting that's mentioned at Spline Cart just for that to work in VR well. Or admittedly, what ends up happening.
Question, actually.
Yeah, go for it.
What would you? So for context, I basically can't play VR because I get inane motion sickness when moving. What would you suggest to run this?
Honestly, Vivecraft has a seated mode, which I'm not sure how well this would work for you for context. But Vivecraft has this seated mode that kind of strikes a middle ground between the immersiveness in VR and the desktop play of flat screen. where you put on the VR headset, you're physically in the world, but you still control the keyboard and mouse, and you're sitting down in a chair. I don't know if that would be better or worse. That would be the thing I would recommend trying if it's the standing and physical moving around that causes the sickness.
Will this be compatible with the Steam Deck gyroscope? In this case, you just move the Steam Deck and then the screen moves with it.
In theory, you could make something like that. Vivecraft is only like designed from the ground up to like connect to VR headsets in one way or another. So you would need to like hack a VR implementation onto Vivecraft to do that. Technically, it would work. In practice, I would recommend doing something. I think there's multiple design decisions that I would do differently if you were doing like gesture-based, or I guess, sorry. Oh my gosh, what's the term? The control scheme as you described, I think there's a very different design philosophy for doing that in comparison to doing VR directly. Yeah, right now it uses OpenVR under the hood in terms of the API, which is what Steam VR uses. Right now they're trying to also add OpenXR support, which should hopefully come soon, TM. So yeah, OpenVR, basically like Steam VR or any other implementation of Steam VR should work, and then OpenXR is coming soon, TM, to support, you know, all the other VR runtimes. Yeah, ALVR totally works. Steam VR is great. Steam VR is neat. It's, you know, it's been superseded by OpenXR because that's like the vendor agnostic effectively API. So, you know. Yeah, any other questions? I'm out of questions, that's fair. I will take that as a no then from everyone. Thank you so much for coming.